This is The Audience Connection, the podcast where we go beyond what connects and into why it actually sticks.
Episodes are grounded in both research and real-world experience, unpacking what's behind audience behavior, from psychology and neuroscience to cultural cues and decision-making.
And then we ground all those principles into real-world applications, so you understand exactly how to create stories that are memorable and change behavior.
We talk to brand storytellers, behavior scientists, and communication leaders about the real drivers of attention, trust, and action.
Sponsored by Casual, where behavioral science meets storytelling to build trust for your audiences.
We're your hosts, Ollie Atkinson and Lydia Chan. Hello and welcome back to The Audience Connection, everyone. Our guest today is Oliver Markeson, co-founder of Neurohaus. His work focuses on helping brands understand how neurodivergent people actually experience their environments. A really important conversation for our show because 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent. So really glad to have Ollie on because neurodiversity has had such a significant mainstream media attention in recent years, and it's good for us to be contributing positively to that conversation.
Completely. If you think about 20% of your audience being neurodiverse, it becomes really quite crucial to address that area of the market. And in this episode, we explore this powerful idea that neurodiverse audiences are often overlooked. But as Ollie explains, if you create calmer, clearer, more intentional brand experiences, it doesn't just serve them better. It actually improves the experience for everyone. And we also go into Ollie's personal experience into all of this, which is really interesting. He was a brand strategist before starting Neurohaus, but then received this late diagnosis of ADHD, dyslexia, and autistic traits, and started connecting the dots between neurodiversity and the way people move through these brand experiences.
Yeah, and really having those personal experiences puts him in the right position to be doing this kind of work. He's done fascinating work with companies like Pandora and Versace, which he goes deeper into in the episode, talking about how he crafted moments that create joy and connection, which is what we're all about on the show.
Yeah, completely. Yeah. So this is one of my favorite episodes so far, and we get into what storytellers, marketers, designers can do to build more inclusive audience experiences.
All right, one to listen all the way through. Here's the conversation with our Ollie and Oliver Markeson.
Hello and welcome back to The Audience Connection. Today I'm joined by Oliver Markeson from Neurohaus, who has a background in brand strategy and now is running an organization that helps behavior design for the neurodivergent community. Now, Ollie, welcome to the show. It is great to have you here.
Thank you. Pleasure to join you.
Brilliant. So today we're going to be exploring Neurohaus and how your work has really kind of changed the ability for neurodivergent people to experience retail, but that spreads out into lots of other areas. And it would be great, before we jump into all of that, it'd be great to understand a bit, take us back to the start.
I kind of became aware of my own neurodivergence and then kind of linked to that how we landed on the idea for Neurohaus. But so I went back to university later in life. I kind of felt like I had some unfinished business with academia, having not particularly engaged or barely engaged at all with academia the first time round. And I kind of knew that I had a desire to read and to study, even though I mean, not being flippant, but I've really struggled to read. And so kind of by strange kind of logic, I suppose, almost like a sadomasochistic logic, I thought if I go back to university, then the professors will make me read. And so, at this point, I had no idea I was neurodivergent. I just knew that was kind of how my brain works. And I need kind of real pressure to be able to engage with things. And so, I enrolled here I applied to the University of Oxford to do a master's program. And in my mid-30s, and it was actually in the application process that there was a cleverly worded question within a college form, and it simply said, do you have or think you might have kind of challenges relating to learning, like ADHD, dyslexia, whatever it might be. And I kind of thought, well, no one's ever asked me that question before, and I've never thought that I might. But you know what? That would kind of figure, like that would explain why I can't really read more than a paragraph at a time, and so kind of tick the box. And so yeah, not long after was diagnosed with ADHD, dyslexia, and traits of autism. And yeah, it took me till I was kind of in my mid-30s to discover that. But then I said to friends from my undergraduate years, you know, I've just been diagnosed with kind of hardcore ADHD, and they all said, well, yeah, obviously. So
We've known it all along, Ollie.
Yeah, it would be nice if someone had mentioned something. Anyway, so that's how I kind of received my diagnosis. But then, together with my wife Amelia, who I set up Neurohaus with, she soon after received a diagnosis of ADHD and autism, and we were sort of going through that journey. A late in life diagnosis is obviously quite a profound thing, and you revisit a lot of life experiences to date, and we started to recognize patterns in our own behavior, really quite distinct behaviors and patterns within behaviors. And we kind of started to connect the dots that actually it was our neurodivergence that was primarily driving those behaviors. What coffee shops do we go to and love and keep going back to, and which ones do we avoid? Kind of how do we shop? Why do we shop that way? Why are there certain shops that we go into and literally want to sit in a dark corner and kind of rock back and forth because you've been overstimulated by, you know, whichever environment you've been in? And so we started to kind of establish those patterns. And then, as you mentioned, with a background in brand strategy, really kind of recognize, like, how is it possible that for the last 20 years I've been in roles where we've been experts on the consumer, and at no point have we had a conversation about the fact that 1 in 5 consumers' brains are wired fundamentally differently. 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent, and our brains are wired fundamentally differently.
Oh, that's so high, isn't it? 1 in 5.
Yeah,
really.
It's a lot of folk.
Yeah. And I think there's this whole idea, isn't there? People saying like, oh, more people are being diagnosed at the moment, but that's probably due to underdiagnosis previously, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of a point of contention at the moment about underdiagnosis, overdiagnosis, and, you know, recently, quite emphatically, actually, Cambridge, our friends down the road, have done a fairly conclusive study, or kind of a number of academics have concluded quite emphatically that overdiagnosis is not a thing. And really, it's just catching up. You know, it's kind of an analogy often is given about left-handed and right-handed, and it kind of saying that, you know, that all of a sudden there are loads of people coming out saying that they were left-handed. They kind of in the last century, and it's like, well, no, that's because you could never be left-handed.
Yeah.
You know, you used to get whatever it was, you get hit at school if you wrote with your left hand, and it was only when you started to be allowed to express yourself and write with your left hand that more people, lo and behold, were left-handed. There's a natural number of people who are left-handed and right-handed, and all it was getting to that natural number. And so kind of that's what we primarily see at the moment is a kind of people recognizing their neurodivergence increasingly. And actually, I find a lot of the headlines about overdiagnosis quite unhelpful, because the biggest, most chronic issue is people not knowing that they're neurodivergent. And there's still a huge number of people that have no idea, and that has profound implications on their lives. And so, you know, I would far rather live in a world where some people are misdiagnosed, you know, but you catch more people, you know, that you sweep up more people who actually are neurodivergent, as opposed to those people being missed. Because if you are missed, the implications on kind of social impact and health and well-being are really quite profound. And so it's important that it is recognized.
How do you then take that into a brand and communicate that to them so they kind of understand neurodivergence? You know, is there, because it's you know, immediately you can drift into labels or unhelpful language, right? What's the best way of explaining it when you do?
Sure. So, I mean, when we work with various brands, you know, we address both the two communities: a brand's kind of internal people, kind of employee experience, and brands, consumer experience. And ultimately, they are essentially the same. Obviously, you address them in different contexts, but ultimately, you're talking about humans who have brains that are wired differently. And so, kind of the first step is to really start with what is neurodiversity. I mean, this is one of the challenges we face in the area that we're in, is that we've almost jumped forward a few steps. We talk about what are the implications of neurodiversity on consumer behavior. Understandably, first, actually, what we need to talk about is what is neurodiversity. It's quite a big and it's quite a impenetrable word. It's almost frustratingly intimidating as a word, and so it's a case of kind of really breaking down what does neurodiversity mean, acknowledging that it is a highly complex word. It's an umbrella term for a number of different neurotypes beneath it, but equally we need to be able to make it feel simple and accessible in order that brands can do something about it. And that's, I hope that we are like good teachers, in the sense that a good teacher will take something that is profoundly complex and make it feel as though it's simple and accessible. And that's kind of really the starting point. And that can take a couple of forms. One is, basic kind of awareness and understanding training. But then another thing that we really enjoy doing is form of what we call empathy training, which is where we simulate how it feels to be neurodivergent. Because you can describe something to people all you like in theory, but actually the feeling of being neurodivergent is so distinct that if you are neurotypical, with the best will in the world, you don't really get your head around it until someone simulates how it feels. And that for us is a really helpful kind of first step. And then we start to drill down into, okay, so what are the implications on consumer behavior or consumer environments or communications or whatever it might be, or for your people who are at work every day, and currently the neurodivergent 20% are often quite overlooked, and has real impact on their performance and happiness in the workplace.
That idea of making people feel something is great, because I love the fact that that really taps into the subconscious rather than the conscious mind, doesn't it? Because essentially you are experiencing it, and then you come away being like, oh, I actually know what that so it makes you do something about it, right? And making it very easy for people to act is the whole key. What does that look like, though? How do you make someone feel experience a neurodivergent world?
Sure, yeah. I mean, without kind of giving away all the details of our training, but no. But from a theoretical perspective, it's a case of like simulating. If you think about, so for example, ADHD and dyslexia for me, and traits of autism all lead to things like sensory sensitivity, challenge processing information, impacting on the self-esteem, and so it's a case of, in an environment where you simulate those feelings, it's a case of, for example, the moment people come into the training, put them on the back foot, make them feel like they've done something wrong, even though they haven't, and erode their sense of self. This sounds like a brutal thing to do, but like essentially it's an unexpected approach to a training, and then set them tasks and kind of highlight how challenging those tasks can be, and ultimately, distract them. Overwhelm them sensorially, and it's all done obviously in a controlled environment, and everyone knows kind of what's going on. But only at that point can you really start to simulate how it feels on a daily basis. And what's interesting is that when we do this training, we get two reactions. We either get okay, wow, like hang on a minute. That's how it feels. I feel awful because my best mate has told me they've got ADHD, and I feel like I've been really dismissive of it until now, or whatever it is. Or actually, quite commonly, we say at the end of the training, okay, like, how did that feel? And every single time we get people say, familiar. And it leads to people recognizing their own neurodivergence, because a lot of the things that we simulate actually are things that people experience day to day if they are neurodivergent. But until someone calls out that those are neurodivergent behaviors, that's how you can go through your life without recognizing that you are neurodivergent. Until someone explicitly says, like, no, like not everyone feels like this every day. Like this is within the construct of your own neurotype and kind of wiring of your brain. So these are kind of just important kind of building blocks, if you like, to get towards an understanding of something, which again is quite complex.
Yeah. And I think when we had our initial talk, you were talking about these feelings of overwhelm and this sensory overload, and definitely that's what happened with me. I suddenly started going like, actually, you know what, this feels quite familiar, and having kind of gone down my full journey on it. But yeah, I completely understand that as well. And we've just made a film for HSBC, which is about the accessibility tools that they have for neurodivergent people. And we'll try to do something similar in video, right? So we're trying to kind of do someone with ADHD, very kind of bright lights coming on the screen, or maybe kind of like dialed up sound design. So there's a kind of sense of overwhelm at the beginning of the film. But I do love that idea of bringing people in and putting them on the back foot, because again, that's going to kind of really get that visceral response to it as well. So yeah,
100%. No, it's an exciting one, and I'm pleased that you're engaging in the space and that brands you work with are also, because it's a massive audience who've been hugely overlooked, chronically overlooked for so long. You can kind of understand why though. Like it's not like anyone has been particularly bad or kind of it's a natural progression, kind of cultural progression, to go from, if you think that neurodiversity is something which within the context of neurodivergence, one of the things that the neurodivergent community can struggle with is self-advocacy. It's so internalized as an experience that it's something which it's only natural that it's taking some time for people to not only recognize their own neurodivergence, and now there's a huge amount of work which is happening within the community for self-advocacy and kind of community advocacy. And it takes a while for that to then actually go through to awareness and understanding among the neurotypical majority, and for brands to then start to do something about it. It's quite a journey that we're on. And kind of we're just trying to catalyze that, if you like, and kind of raise the importance of it.
Yeah. And it's one thing kind of, for people to understand it in themselves, but it's another thing to move and policy and brands and these gigantic machines to actually move to doing something that works, genuinely works, is hard. But you talked a bit about sort of mappable behaviors and this sort of distinct mappable behaviors that brands can use. And so what are the behaviors that brands typically overlook, the biggest, and what makes them mappable?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so let's have a think, because we work in different environments. So we do everything from kind of insight and mapping for things like web UX or kind of app UX, or store design or events, customer journey, kind of retail excellence. Really, any interaction between a human and a brand has implications on the senses and the way that you process information and identity. Kind of brands plus humans equals really those things.
Yeah.
And for the neurodivergent community, processing information, sensory stimulus, and the way that we engage with humans are all kind of things which are particularly heightened. So there's like a massive overlap really on all fronts. And then for us, like if we look at, say, for example, retail environments, things that are overlooked, behaviors which are overlooked, we go shopping with neurodivergent respondents. So it's not just ourselves. I mean, so it's myself and my wife. We're a spin out from the University of Oxford. So we're an incorporated business within the university, and we went through the Oxford University Innovation Incubator. And so we work with academics from across the research community here. And then we also at Oxford, and then we also have our own community of about 600 neurodivergent respondents from a range of neurotypes. And depending on the client, the brand, we take those people and put them through the customer journey. So now in the context of retail, it depends on the neurotype. There are different behaviors, but it's super interesting. So take autism, for example. Often when we share the findings with clients, we say like, okay, you're not going to believe us how mappable this behavior is. So like, just as a full like disclosure before we share the insight, you're going to say it's impossible that it's that mappable. We've worked with brands where autistic shoppers will not only like, they will walk, every single one will walk into the store and they will follow exactly the same path around the store. They will all turn right as opposed to left, and we can see the reasons why they don't turn left and why they turn right. The way that they process the consideration journey for them is again identical in the way that they review all of the products available, the way that they will not want to speak to a member of staff until they're actually definitely ready to speak to them. They won't want to waste the staff member's time. They won't want the social interaction until they know what they're asking for. They'll want to feel like they have considered everything before they engage. So like just super interesting journeys that you start to see. Or if you take, if you layer onto that ADHD, where you also have a lot of kind of sensory sensitivity, you start to see commonalities within retail spaces, things which we would define as triggers, things which make you kind of, at best, they like throw you and make you want to leave the store and you just about manage to buy something and then leave. At worst, it just makes you abandon cart, you know, and just walk out the door, you know, and that can be anything from the sound system to the lighting to the sense of people in your space. You know, again, those trigger points are so consistent, regardless of the kind of the individual that we're with. You can map them against neurotype and kind of more broad neurodivergent behaviors. And it's interesting to think about, okay, where are there behaviors which are specific to certain neurotypes that are distinctive and require highlighting, but also on the behalf of brands, to start to look for commonalities across neurotypes. Because as soon as you can say this impacts neurodivergent individuals at large, that's an addressable market, 20%, that brands can start to, I mean, it really makes sense commercially, right, to get right with that audience.
Significant, yeah.
Yeah, and that's important for us. The commercial reality is important for us, because if you can't highlight the commercial reality, you're relying on brands doing this because it's the right thing to do. You know, in the current environment,
we've seen that crumble recently, right? You know,
right? Yeah. And so, like in the current environment, it's impossible to expect brands to do things based purely on kind of a social kind of purpose basis. And so, you know, if you can leverage commercial opportunity for brands to ultimately improve the experience for the neurodivergent community, then you have a win-win. And that's a more realistic way to improve the lived experience for those people who are neurodivergent.
Yeah, I got to say, I mean, I'm starting to see a lot more when I'm walking around shopping centers, more days where the lighting will be dimmed, or there's a quiet day where shopping experience is different, right? Because I think we're, you know, and I think when we spoke previously a while back, talking really about, I personally feel like Zara or some of these stores, the lighting is so bright in there. I'm not sure it's good for anyone really to be shopping in that light. But yeah, no, I think it's starting to take hold. What would you say, you know, if someone wants to start doing this internally, wants to start to raise awareness or start to kind of campaign for doing this, what would you say the kind of a first step might be for them?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And just quickly on the point of kind of brands like Zara, yes, so overwhelmingly bright. And actually, to your point, it's a really important one, is that it's not good for anyone to be in that environment. And what we find often is that when we make improvements for the neurodivergent 20%, in fact, we always find that when we make improvements for the neurodivergent 20%, you're ultimately making it better for everybody. Right. Who doesn't enjoy a shopping experience which is less sensorially overwhelming? Who doesn't prefer information which is easier to process?
And then it's like, well, how have they got to that point where they are so offensive?
Yeah, no, I mean, sure. Yeah, no. And again, there's a, on the one hand, it's a commercial reality, right? Which is without pushback, you're gonna shove more and more products in. you're going to want kind of, I suppose, there's a commercial reality, which is like, can people pick up the item and see it, and what does it look like? And I guess in a Zara environment, you don't want everybody going to the changing rooms. You want people to be able to pick it up and look at it and figure, yeah, okay, I'll try it on at home, and then maybe I'll bring it back and maybe I won't, and whatever. And you can sort of start to see the commercial reasons as to why you'd have an environment like that.
Cost as well, massive LED strips, cold lighting, it's cost efficient. Yeah.
And I guess there's an element of cost as well, like the commercial implications of building retail environments, which is that you're always going to take the quickest build and the cheapest cost until someone gives you a good reason not to. No one has ever articulated the business case to not do that until now. And so we are the first to be doing this. And so we do find ourselves having interesting conversations with store design teams where, it all makes perfect sense once you have the conversation, but until you've had the conversation, it's not a consideration. No one wants to frazzle their customers, right?
No.
And so, the whole world is designed for the neurotypical majority. And again, because the voice of the neurodivergent has always been, for reasons we covered earlier, kind of quieter. And so, anything, and when we talk about consumer experiences, we're not just talking about retail, we're talking about how it is to take a flight, to go on holiday, to stay in a hotel, some of the behaviors we see with people with neurodivergent visitors in hotels is extraordinarily mappable, and like a really acute need for a multitude of reasons, which again is kind of overlooked. And it's just because brands haven't yet recognized it, or brands are starting to recognize it with the brands that we're working with. But yeah, until someone kind of says, whoa, stop, we haven't thought this through from this perspective, it's an insight that has been hitherto not on the table. Then to kind of loop back to your question about kind of what would be a first step for brands to engage in this space. I would always advocate for, this sounds like a sales pitch. It's not, if you spoke to us or you spoke to somebody else who had strategic guidance in this space, we ultimately are seeking a world that is inclusive of the neurodivergent 20%, right? But it's the strategic insight which is so important, because, there's often a lot of weight falls on neurodivergent individuals within organizations. And that's fine. And you do often find that those individuals are really passionate about it and are building ERGs, and they're building kind of a groundswell around the neurodivergent community. But it can then be overwhelming for those individuals to be expected to kind of fully structure initiatives and training and awareness around neurodiversity, and actually seeking support, I'd say, is just so important, in order that you don't overwhelm the individuals who actually you need to be supporting from overwhelm. What we found with the brands that we work with is that you kind of start by starting. And yes, we have conversations with brands and we say, we could support you across these areas: web UX, retail design, brand activations, like blah, 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 blah. But you're not going to do it all at once. And so we tend to start with one area. So we might start with, okay, we will do an insight study around your web UX, or we will do kind of a review of your stores from a neurodivergent perspective. And then that allows you to get some traction and something to have as an anchor point internally. And we then help brands to seek cultural change. A lot of the work we do actually is about internal cultural change, supporting teams internally with roundtables across departments, socializing insights and learnings, making business cases for budgets. That's another thing. And so we kind of help guide that, but start by doing one focused project and then seeking to kind of push it across the organization tends to be more successful and also pragmatic than a brand kind of trying to do everything at once.
Yeah. I mean, it's exactly the same way that we tend to grow with a brand is we produce a really effective video. They see a business result off the back of it, and then they commission more off the back of it. So yeah, start small, essentially. And one thing my head is still hanging on to from what you were talking about earlier is this repeatable journey around a store. So, and how do you, designing for that, can you kind of go into that a bit more deeply? Because I just find it fascinating that everyone is doing, for neurodivergent people are doing the same journey around the store. Can you explain why and how you would design to support that experience?
Sure, yeah. And again, it depends on the kind of the neurotype and the patterns of behavior. And there are certain things that you can do. For example, one thing that forces everyone to take the same path is the things that they're avoiding.
Right.
So one thing is to embrace the way that someone's navigating the store, which is fine, and let people navigate it how they want to navigate it. Or you recognize that, hang on a minute, maybe we've got this kind of very specific track because there are certain things which people are avoiding so much that they're all choosing the same path of least resistance around the store. And I'd hypothesize that it's more the latter. So therefore, what you should be focusing on is what are the things that are forcing all of these people to take the same route? What are they avoiding? One is often queuing. So kind of queuing for many neurodivergent folk is a challenge. If you wanted to see kind of early pioneering work within neuroinclusivity, you'd only need to look at places like Disney World, who kind of were very early in terms of accessibility and recognizing that a lot of the neurodivergent community struggle with queuing. For lots of reasons. Can be the concept of queuing. It can be the proximity of other people in your space. It can be kind of the sensory overwhelm of the queuing environment itself. And they offer alternative queuing systems, virtual queuing systems for those who are neurodivergent. Now, if you walk into a store and the first thing you see on your left-hand side are the dreaded, VIP like hanging ropes, you're going to turn right, you're not going to turn left. And so, understanding kind of what those trigger points are is one thing. And then the other interesting thing, the flip side to that, is what I don't want the perception to be that, we sort of go around store environments as kind of like, with a clipboard saying like, no, like, yes, we highlight trigger points. Of course we do. But also an exciting part of what we do is identifying what we call glimmers, which is the opposite of a trigger. So it stands to reason that if you are neurodivergent and you are sensitive sensorially, yes, there are certain things that you will find more challenging and more overwhelming than others, but there'll also be sensory experiences which you find disproportionately more pleasurable than your neurotypical peers. And that's something that you can lean into as a retailer. Why wouldn't you create moments that a lot of your consumers would find extremely pleasurable? So, for example, I work with Versace. I mean, it's a very small example, but like in a luxury store, they present their products obviously in beautiful ways, and they have these kind of almost like velvet-lined boxes that they put their socks in. And I will genuinely be found by Amelia in a store, just like stroking the velvet, and so, I mean, that's a kind of a silly little example, but like there's amazing things you can do with AV and with sound and like different sensory experiences that you might find in gallery spaces or experiential design that you can incorporate into retail spaces, which flip the experience. We were living in the States for a couple of years, and when we relocated, we came back through Orlando with our service dog. And airports are horrifying. They're totally overwhelming. And they're normally a place of real overwhelm. And in Orlando, I hope they still have it, but in Orlando, in the middle of the terminal, they have these huge, like kind of 20-foot high immersive screens that create this immersive zone. And as you move, the bubbles in the water move. And Amelia and I found ourselves dancing in the middle of an airport, surrounded by moving bubbles, having the most wonderful, blissful time. And so like you can create moments that all of a sudden, all of those triggers kind of quieten, and the glimmer can flip the experience. But just no one's ever really kind of thought about retail design like that.
That's
before.
interesting. It's an opportunity to be really creative, isn't it? And do
totally
artistic, interesting things that that everyone will enjoy. Yeah. So let's run through a few case studies on how you've actually applied this in the real world. Now, you've mentioned Versace before. You also work with Pandora, right? Can you take us through a little bit about what you've done for them?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yes. So Pandora, it's super interesting how we've identified brands which, when we talk about neurodivergent 20%, there are certain brands actually that kind of really over-index neurodivergent. It's not to say it isn't important for all brands, but there are certain brands for whom there is a naturally kind of neurodivergent interest in the brand. Pandora is one of them. Kind of the nature of their products is that it's kind of very sensory, jewelry, very sensory, whether it's a necklace or a ring, and also highly collectible. And so kind of that's often a very neurodivergent behavior. And so they're a super interesting brand in terms of the extent to which there's so much love for Pandora products within the community, but also Pandora having amazing equity in the space of kind of inclusion, same as Versace actually. And so kind of we knew that we were in really safe hands with both of those two brands to kind of pioneer this space. Pandora, we started on store design, and kind of Pandora recognized that they have hundreds, thousands of stores all over the world. And so what we can work on is kind of future rollout. It will take a long time for us to obviously bring our kind of the implications of our work onto all of the existing stock. That is obviously the ambition, but kind of as we roll out new stores at Pandora, we are incorporating neuroinclusive principles into the physical design of those retail spaces. And so it was kind of an amazing initial project that we did with Pandora, where we visited Pandora stores, did shop-alongs in key markets across multiple cities in the US, Disney World, and also kind of the UK, Copenhagen, Italy, and really interesting to kind of recognize not only patterns within kind of store design, and we talk about those triggers and we talk about the glimmers, but also to recognize kind of cultural nuances for global brands and the way that neurodiversity is kind of seen and understood and valued, and to kind of really work on what would kind of a store environment, how would you ultimately want it to feel so it is inclusive for the neurodivergent 20%, while being realistic about commercial kind of realities, right? Which is presenting products and having a lot of people in your store at once and kind of commercial realities. And so we kind of take a very pragmatic approach, whether it is Pandora or Versace. But it's interesting to look at kind of different brands and different retail spaces, and you can see that Versace, or Versace, as I meant to pronounce it, still struggle now into our third year working with Versace.
The way you started gesticulating.
You've got to do the
well,
Italian,
like
Versace. Those physical retail spaces are quite different. A luxury store in many ways is already quite neuro-inclusive in its design. And then you move to Pandora, which is high street, and part of our overall strategy and ambition is to have an impact, obviously, with every part of society. But when you start to work with Pandora, you start to really get scale and high street impact, and kind of the differences and the commonalities between those environments. And actually, there was a really interesting period where we were working with, if you park Pandora for a second, where we were working with Versace and Goodwill in America at the same time. I didn't know Goodwill when we moved to the States. My wife Amelia had, only because they're name checked in Gossip Girl.
I don't know. So tell me who Goodwill are.
Goodwill are like the equivalent of kind of an Oxfam store, if you like, in America.
Okay. Right.
But they're something of a cultural kind of institution in America. They're pretty much the only large-scale thrift store across the whole of America. And in true American style, they're like super size me kind of football fields of thrift. And so working with both Versace and Goodwill at the same time was fascinating, literally opposite ends of the retail spectrum. but also recognizing where the overlaps were, the commonalities of insight between the two was was absolutely fascinating. And so it's been a journey for us where we've been kind of now really have quite a broad experience of different retail environments, from kind of large scale, supersize scale kind of retail footprints down to kind of more boutique-y luxury spaces and everything in between. And, even within one brand, you could have a store which is, you could have a huge Pandora store kind of on Fifth Avenue or wherever, and you could have a tiny little concession in a shopping mall. And there are different considerations kind of within each context. But it's been interesting to look at those from a kind of a store design perspective. And then I can talk kind of more about kind of where we've worked with different brands on different aspects of the consumer experience beyond just kind of retail spaces.
Could that even be applied to a sort of B2B environment where there's sort of that it's a different journey, right? And people have different motivations, or there's just a different setup. But obviously you've got neurodivergent communities in the B2B space. Have you had any experience with that as well?
Yeah, we have actually. We've had some interesting conversations about like recognizing that kind of the way that you talk to potential customers, who may well be neurodivergent, and kind of what is a way to do that is kind of inclusive, I think is important. I can't think of any what would be a physical B2B space.
Well, I guess it's more the kind of conversation you're having with a B2B client, really.
Yeah.
I guess that's the way you're doing it.
I think there's kind of a huge amount of insight that you can have. I mean, if you are in the business of B2B and you want to know your audience, just like anyone else wants to know their audience, and you think, depends on the sector that you're working in, but let's say you work in tech. Kind of there's reading a book about this kind of autism pandemic in LA in the kind of early noughties. Like, oh my God, suddenly everyone's autistic. What's going on? Everyone's catching it from each other. Bullshit. No, it's called Silicon Valley. And what happens is autistic people who are utterly brilliant at coding from all around the world have moved to Silicon Valley, and they've met people who are autistic, and, they've had children, and, often people who are autistic have autistic children. I think that's all it is, really. It's not that it's a pandemic of autism. You start to find pockets and communities where the neurodivergent community are highly represented. Technology is one of them. The creative industry is another. So if you're in the B2B world and you're working with people who are creative, or even if you work in B2B and you're working with audiences who are professional athletes, I mean, you are twice as likely to have ADHD if you're a professional athlete. And so there are all sorts of considerations for like what your trade is and who you're working with, and the extent to which those kind of neurodivergent behaviors are kind of really important to understand, so that you can not only be effective at what you're doing, but also respectful of what you're doing. How
do you communicate day to day with it? What are the kind of best starting points when you're thinking about internal culture?
Yeah, definitely. And in that instance, I would say for sure listening to your neurodivergent staff. Those that obviously the important thing to remember is that you'll have a lot of neurodivergent staff who either know they're neurodivergent and haven't told you about it, or who don't know that they're neurodivergent.
Yeah.
But actually, just by opening the conversation. So for example, when we go and do a talk at whichever brand we're working with, just us going and doing a talk will mean that people come up at the end and say, okay, I've never really spoken about this at work before, but I'm neurodivergent, and whatever it is. And if you don't already have an ERG internally, that can be something that can spark it, or can start to create some groundswell around it. And kind of what we say to brands is that ERGs are important, but don't worry if not many people turn up. Because actually, for a lot of neurodivergent individuals, it is quite a personal thing. People are on their own journey. Not everyone wants to go and sit in a room and talk to other people about their neurodivergence. But just knowing it's there is the most important thing. We had a client who, in a previous role, had set up an LGBTQIA+ ERG. They noticed, firstly, rather sadly, that the sign-up rate for the ERG that people tended to join after they'd passed their first performance review which is just a galling kind of truth of human behavior. But actually those people said, that the most important thing to them was knowing that that community was there, even if they weren't an active participant in it. And so kind of creating something of a organizing point internally is so important for people to feel seen and valued. And then from a kind of how you then communicate with your staff, it kind of opens up quite a big kind of how long is a piece of string kind of conversation around kind of what should brands be doing with their employees. And again, what we advocate is that, please don't think that by having an ERG, you've addressed neurodiversity, because you haven't. Kind of the breadth and depth of the implications of neurodiversity on the employee experience are great and need to be considered with the rigor and integrity that they deserve. Everything from the way that you communicate roles before the people have even joined the organization, to what people can expect from interviews, the way that the interviews are run, through to onboarding, performance reviews, day-to-day kind of routine, all the way through to exit interviews. I mean, and that requires policy, and it requires frameworks, and it requires training, and it requires management training and empathy. And if you get it right, again, if you want to talk about the cold hard facts from a commercial perspective, you see the most astonishing, this is where I need Amelia, she's amazing with statistics, but the statistics are really quite profound, where if you make reasonable adjustments in the workplace, your retention rate of neurodivergent individuals it is extraordinary. Whereas if you don't, a lot of those neurodivergent individuals have a high intent to leave your organization. So obviously one of the most expensive things is losing and replacing people. And also with your neurodivergent staff, if you create the right environment for them, you unlock the most extraordinary capabilities and performance, which again is a total no-brainer for the people that you've hired in the first place. Why wouldn't you enable them to be at their best? So kind of actually the work that is required internally pales into insignificance versus the unlock that you get from a sense of inclusion and belonging. Yeah, sure, but also from a performance and retention perspective.
That reminds me of something you said earlier when we chatted before around the number of entrepreneurial people that are actually neurodivergent. And so you're losing out on these opportunities to have like star players, essentially, if you're not addressing this properly.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Ollie. You're right. You're absolutely right. And yeah, there's a lot of conversation around the challenges that the neurodivergent community face, and that's important because we do face lots of challenges. But there are also great strengths to neurodivergent minds, but those great strengths need to be in the right environment. When you are in the right environment, you unlock, yes, lateral thinking, like for sure, 100% is a very kind of, I wouldn't say common neurodivergent behavior. It is you often see Apple's The Crazy Ones advert, which is utterly brilliant and sort of quite iconic. I don't know, I'm not here to diagnose people, but I can't imagine anybody in that ad is neurotypical. And kind of that idea of seeing patterns differently to other people, being able to analyze problems and come up with alternative solutions, but then doing it in a way that is kind of not just creative, but quite pioneering in the line of thought. I mean, there's a reason why places like GCHQ actively hire neurodivergent individuals, because they're utterly brilliant at solving problems. And they recognize that if they don't have neurodivergent individuals there, their operational capacity is significantly weakened. So it's not just like a competitive advantage, it's a necessary inclusion. And there's literally no reason why that shouldn't apply to other organizations.
So how do brands do this without getting it wrong, right? Like, how does the sort of inclusion not include special treatment, making people feel singled out, or what are the watch outs, I guess, for starting with this?
It's a great question, Ollie, and I'm so pleased you asked it. And I'm not often asked that question, and I think brands should always be asking that question. It's super important. What we don't want to do is to in any way scaremonger or to put people off engaging in the space. The most important thing is that people do their best to engage with the community. And so instances where people have got it wrong in the past has always come from a well-intentioned place, and would far rather, people engaged and got it wrong than didn't engage at all. However, it's an important question. How do you do it in a sensitive way and a meaningful way? The one thing that we kind of dubbed early, and we've been very cautious of, is kind of neuro washing, which will happen. It's coming, like greenwashing.
Yeah, of course.
It's such a zeitgeisty topic, and there's a real danger that brands just, tick a box or do something tokenistic. The moment that like you kind of get, like, I'm fearing the moment you have like a Walker's Crisps ad, let's put an autistic kid in our ad, or this is coming from someone who's worked on briefs and ad agencies for years, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just what I fear. I fear the moment it lands as like an executional, opportunistic, kind of superficial thing, as opposed to a meaningful, deeply integrated thing. Mm-hmm. And it should definitely start there before it appears in communications. Now, how to get it right? One, listen to the neurodivergent community, 100%. We are a conduit to the neurodivergent community ourselves, and there are other ways that you can speak to the neurodivergent community, but kind of the bit where we would also advocate for is that strategic rigor and pushback. So it's like, okay, like, we've heard the neurodivergent community, but is this the right way to do this? Like, what are the watch outs here? Like you'd have in developing any other initiative. Any initiative with any organization tends to be done with partners who you consult with, who will challenge you strategically and make sure you've taken the right step. What we sometimes see with the neurodivergent community is that it's well-intentioned, but it misses that asking the tough questions moment. Because you can understandably get excited about the fact that you're doing something great for the community, but without reining it in and saying, is this the right thing to do? And so kind of having a balance of both the neurodivergent community's input, but also asking the tough questions as to kind of, is this right or not? I would say that balance is kind of super important. And then finally, to pick up on your point about not making people feel other, that is the biggest watch out. If I could say like one thing, please, everything that we do with the brands that we work with avoids otherness. There's never a point at which anyone is identified as being a neurodivergent consumer. There's never a point at which you have to self-identify. There's any of these things. We just say, well, if you create an environment or an experience for consumers, for employees, but focus here on consumers as an example, if you create a retail environment that is designed for the neurodivergent 20% or through the lens of neurodiversity, if you happen to be neurodivergent and walk into the store, then it's a good experience for you. It improves it for you and actually for everyone else anyway. But there are some examples of where you need to self-identify and where brands kind of say, oh, if you come into this environment and say that you're neurodivergent, we'll give you a sensory pack or, whatever it is. It's well-intentioned, but I'm having to self-identify in an environment where I'm already overwhelmed. And also don't think that you can just create like a Band-Aid solution to your overwhelming environment by giving me a sensory pack. How about you make your environment not overwhelming? And so that's the kind of the thing that can feel like a bit of a tick box, even if it is well-intentioned. And so, avoiding othering at all costs.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? It's about respecting it and empathizing and understanding it rather than singling out. These are things that will help a neurotypical audience as well. So it's worth kind of looking at that in the first place.
if you're doing something, it feels genuine and meaningful, and not like, just as an example, again, it's well-meaning, but I looked at the local council swimming pool the other day, and found on the opening hours or whatever, it says, we are delighted to be able to offer, accessible swimming hours for the neurodivergent community when we'll turn down the music and the lights and whatever. It's available between 2 and 3 p.m. on Wednesdays. And an asterisk, not available during school holidays. And it's like, well, thank you. Like,
get it in the diary, because it's not going to be very many opportunities to do it.
Yeah, exactly right. And that just doesn't help at all, because it's like, come on, really? It just makes you feel worse. And again, it's like, how about you consider your lighting and your music all of the time, as opposed to me needing to have a special 1 hour, not every week. So yeah.
So, we're very conscious now around accessibility in the films that we produce.
Yep.
Is there something else that needs to be considered when we're producing something to make it more accessible for a neurodivergent community?
Interesting. And I'll answer kind of in 2 parts. So to your first question about like other mediums, I think it's an interesting one, where I taught for many years at a creative school in London, a brilliant creative school for kind of the budding kind of creatives going into the industry in London. And they were quite pioneering in creating a virtual reality version of the school. And it was very interesting, because we saw within that environment, we saw students who were known to be neurodivergent, who would display often kind of more carefree, less masked, more confident versions of themselves in the VR version of the school.
Right.
Super interesting. Now, there are whys and wherefores and debates around this, and actually you should be able to create a physical environment where that isn't the case. But there's a truth that people can find kind of some confidence. You often find the neurodivergent community will, not always, but there are many neurodivergent individuals who will find kind of belonging and friendship in digital spaces like video gaming. And it can help to overcome certain kind of societal kind of consciousness or pressures that you might find in real life. Or rather, not fair to say that it can be real life, but as in physical engagements. And so, I think that's just kind of interesting as an insight. But from a kind of a broader communications perspective, I think what's interesting to consider is that we, the world, are now frazzled, right? Like, our central nervous systems are shot. I make the mistake of looking at the headlines now. Like, in the morning, I should just give myself like
Bleak.
10 minutes a day, like, just, okay, like, look what's going on. Yeah, got it, fine. And, but that's not just a neurodivergent thing. And whether it's what's going on in the world, or whether it's actually the way that, phones are beaming stuff into our faces all the time, and we're kind of, our central nervous systems are through the roof. Now, the neurodivergent relationship with the central nervous system is fundamental, and kind of well studied. And so a lot of what we do kind of considers the central nervous system within physical digital spaces. But actually, if you look, that we see a lot of, especially in a younger generation who've been born entirely wired to smartphones.
Yeah.
There are truths which extend beyond just the neurodivergent community to broader audiences. And so I think that's just quite an interesting question, which is, well, actually, if you design for the neurodivergent 20%, a lot of it is actually very much appreciated by people more broadly because of the extent to which they're overwhelmed. And so, I would be an advocate for the yin to the yang, like, everyone is trying to grab our attention now. Everyone is screaming at us. Everyone's hacking algorithms and trying to get our attention for a nanosecond before we scroll on and whatever. And it's utterly exhausting. My wife and I, just personal anecdote, but we find it quite mesmerizing when content is slowed down. and there's a moment of silence or calm, you know, and everyone's following the same approach to communications now. Everyone's like, well, everyone else is shouting, so we need to shout louder, you know, and he who shouts the loudest wins. It's actually no, like you can. I mean, as BBH used to say, the ad agency, you know, when everyone zigs, you zigzag. Yeah. And it's like, well, why should we all be annihilating people's central nervous systems? Why can't we recognize that there's a desire for taking a beat? And if we can enable that, while, of course, ultimately, always commercially, you want to deliver your message, but there are ways and ways of delivering messages. And so that's what I would kind of find interesting. If I had my old brand planner hat on, from a communications perspective, and I was looking at kind of macro culture and the way that people's brains are kind of wired more broadly, and what could be my most effective way of delivering my message, would be to think about ways of kind of almost counter-culturing the noisy mass.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we've ended up at Casual as well. You know, and a few guests have before said we've now moved on from an attention economy to an intention economy. Is what brands actually are. Brands living by their values. It's no longer about grabbing people's eyeballs. It's kind of like awful thing to think about, actually, grabbing people's eyeballs. But you know, it's about care and connection and how you deliver that, and that can be from all different types of communities, but it has to show up, because otherwise you end up, you know, not practicing what you're preaching, essentially, and then people trust is at an all-time low anyway.
Yes,
and so if you start doing that, then people don't trust your brand, and people start to kind of move away. So
yeah, and meaningful connections too. And you know, if you think about like the when we talk about brands as being like having a relationship with brands, at best you do have a relationship with brands. And if you look at the proxy of kind of friendships, people are thankfully starting to understand more and more, I think, that kind of about certain human behaviors which can be quite toxic, and people recognize that there are certain kind of friendships where actually those friends don't really behave like friends because they don't fill you up. You know, they make you feel awful, kind of drains and radiators, right? And actually you recognize that some people who you've spent time with in the past have been drains, and have not filled you up, have not made you feel better. And, you know, you can kind of say the same for brands, right? And you want to maintain a kind of emotional connection with your consumer. And so thinking about ways that you can fill up your consumer as opposed to just taking what you want from them, which is their attention. Well, what do you want them to do? But now you've got their attention, you want to actually do something. You know, and so I think it's a super interesting area. And then just quickly, just to pick up on the VR point, I think it's interesting to think about the senses when it comes to looking for inspiration from museum curation. There's a whole area. I'm doing a part-time DPhil or PhD here at the moment, and a lot of what I look at is kind of sensory history, and it's kind of ridiculous how, you know, you go into like museums and you're told not to touch things. You know, and that's actually a modern thing. Like, museums never used to stop you from touching things. It was just the fear of letting in people who didn't like really appreciate the arts. You know, well, if we're going to invite people in who aren't, you know, whatever, and kind of like, as you start to open the doors to more people, you put up more barriers because they don't know how to behave. And kind of the idea of not being able to touch something is such a weird thing, because when you've put it in front of me, so I now want to touch it, let me touch it. But you do find a lot of examples in kind of museums, but often more galleries. So like the Fondazione Prada in Milan is amazing for kind of some immersive installations. And they've really, really engaged the senses, and they're super playful and they're super positive. And, you know, they're certainly not like yelling and screaming at you, you know, like it can be quite a kind of a calm experience where you're feeling the senses around you, whether that's negating the senses by making everything dark, or whether that's heightening the senses by making everything bright, or the tactility, or whatever it might be, playing with the senses in experiences doesn't just need to be limited to kind of trendy galleries. Like you can start to incorporate a lot of those principles, both in kind of whether it's retail design or the communications you create or whatever.
Yeah, even in office, like one of the challenges a lot of the teams that we work with is how to engage their employees when they don't have access to their phones because they're taken off them when they go into their workplace, or and these experiences could be a great way to do it, right? There's an opportunity there while people are at your wherever you've got your business to put in an installation and really engage their other senses, and that could really increase memorability.
100%. We had I mean, it's kind of a related point, but like the at Procter and Gamble, where I kind of started life, not life. I wasn't born at Procter and Gamble. It kind of felt like that.
That much of a brand strategist. You were born into the meeting room.
Get the chip put in the back of your head, and that's it. Yeah. Like severance or something. But anyway, P&G, and this is years ago, 20-something years ago. They had sleeping pods in the basement. Amazing. It's like a super comfy, like a first class aeroplane seat. Not that I've ever sat in one, but kind of where you pull like a bubble over your head and put on some headphones, and you could choose like the sound of rainfall or whales echoing or whatever it was. And it was an absolutely incredible kind of sensory immersive experience right in the middle of the office. Now, little did P&G know at the time, but that's where all of the NeuroD kids were going to like unwind. There are things you can put in spaces, whether it's specifically for the neurodivergent community to help them unwind, or as you say, like sensory interactive moments to slow people down for a second. And then you could chat to them about what you want to chat to them about. And then people can go away feeling as if they are restored as opposed to kind of drained.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been absolutely fantastic to have you on. I'd like to wrap up with our question that we always wrap up with, which is our audience of one question. And it's really, when you're writing a piece of content about neurodiverse design, or when you're creating, we often have they say it's good to have one person in mind when you're creating that content. Who or what is that? What is your process like? Who do you think about when you're creating content?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I mean, so from a professional perspective, I would say kind of that we always ensure that obviously it isn't just one person, that we're representing the neurodivergent community, and that within that there's a range of neurotypes. And so everything we do is through the eyes of a range of representative neurotypes and combinations of neurotypes as well, which is another important consideration to make. And so there's definitely kind of more of a science to it than just like think of someone who's neurodivergent. It's and like there's a lot beneath it. But actually, I love the idea. But the brand strategist in me loves the idea of a single-minded kind of who's that person. And I would say to anyone that's engaging in this space, think of someone that they love that is neurodivergent, because we all know someone that's neurodivergent. And that might be a friend from school, it might be your wife, it might be it could literally be any, but given that 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent, and given that diagnoses are on the rise, it affects everybody. And if you can think of someone who you love who is neurodivergent, someone that and you're fond of who's neurodivergent, that kind of helps you to automatically empathize with that individual. And it might be the case of saying, oh, well, hang on a minute. Actually, I've never really actually given that much credence to when my mate in the pub has said, do you know what, mate, I just found out I'm dyslexic. And you've kind of been like, oh yeah, cool, whatever. Isn't everyone a bit dyslexic? Whatever, people say. Yeah. And it can be easily dismissed by anchoring your thinking in that person, and how they must feel, and how kind of the challenges that they might face, but also wishing for a world in which that person that you are fond of or that you love, of course, you'd wish for a world where they felt more included and more comfortable. If that can be your guiding light, that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, I love that. Exactly. You're going to experience that want to change things, right? If you're thinking of that person.
Yeah.
Well, look, thank you so much for coming on. We'll put Neurohaus and links to any case studies in the work that Ollie's mentioned in the podcast in the show notes. So please do have a look at that and check it out and get them in if you're thinking about, exploring this further. But thank you very much for joining.
Super. Thank you for having me.
If this episode sparked something, curiosity, a new way of thinking, or something you're going to take back to the team, we'd love to hear about it.
Absolutely. Make sure you're subscribed, leave us a rating, and drop us a comment. Tell us what stuck and what you want us to explore next. We want to know.
This is The Audience Connection, sponsored by Casual, the video partner for global brands trying to build trust with their audiences. We'll see you next time.